Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Dallas Architecture Forum panel discussion on the intriguing topic architecture and film. We're delighted that each of you have joined us virtually by Zoom. My name is Nate Udaley, the Executive Director of the Forum. Welcome. This evening, we're pleased to have three subject matter experts on the topic of architecture and film for this panel discussion. John Orfield of BOKA Powell will moderate the panel, and he'll be joined by panelists John Mendrip from Beck Architecture and Amy Murphy from the USC School of Architecture. In a few minutes, I'll introduce John, and then he will introduce both of our panelists. Following presentations by the panelists, John Orfield will join John Mendrip and Amy Murphy in a discussion about the topic even further, analyzing the intriguing connections between film and architecture. At the end of the panel discussion, you, our audience members, will have a chance to submit your questions for them via the Zoom Q&A button. Thank you again for joining us. The Forum is fortunate to have some great panel season sponsors who make this panel and others in our season possible. We're grateful to them. They are Galaxy Modern, Purdy McGuire, Turner Construction, and Walter P. Moore. We're also thankful for this evening's panel sponsor, MMF Strategies, Meg Fitzpatrick. As I mentioned, we're very fortunate to have John Orfield moderate this panel. John is a partner and owner in BOKA Powell and a member of the board of the Dallas Architecture Forum. John's an expert in urban planning and sustainability with nearly 40 years of design experience that includes workplace, academic, hotel, and residential projects across the United States and Mexico. Growing up in an artistically inclined family, John developed an interest in exploring the kinship between architecture, film, and dance. Art forms he sees as related in their portrayal of human experience moving through both time and space. He's built on the interest in these areas to create collaborative environments in studios across the United States and Mexico. John earned a Master's of Science in Architecture and Building Design from Columbia University and 2 architecture degrees from Rice University. A lifelong educator, John has taught at the University of Houston College of Architecture, where he earned the Excellence in Teaching Award, and he also was a visiting professor at the Universidad de las Americas in Puebla, Mexico. We're pleased and honored to have John organize and moderate tonight's panel discussion on architecture and film. Welcome, John.
Nate, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the tremendous leadership that you provide for the Dallas Architecture Forum. The service that you and Jean give to the community is remarkable and truly appreciated. It is with great pleasure that I am privileged to introduce our 2 featured panelists tonight, Amy Murphy and John Mendrip. But before I do, a quick word about the focus of the panel. The topic of architecture and film is monumental. It could consume a lifetime of study, and as it has for our panelists. Tonight, however, we have somewhat less time than that, approximately an hour, so we've chosen to focus on a duality in the relationship between architecture and film, how architecture manifests itself in film, and how films are viewed within architecture, or more succinctly, architecture and film and architecture. This topic was intriguing to us because of the mainly obvious commonalities to both disciplines: the passage of time, the articulation of movement through space, and the creation of narrative. Our first panelist, Amy Murphy, is going to lead off with a presentation on the role of architecture within film. Amy is an associate professor at USC School of Architecture. She holds both a Bachelor of Architecture degree and a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Rhode Island School of Design, as well as a Master of Fine Arts degree in film production and a PhD in media studies from USC's School of Cinematic Arts. In addition to her teaching responsibilities, Amy has acted as the School of Architecture's Vice Dean from 2008 to 2013, and the school's Diversity Liaison from 2015 to 2020. She ran her own design practice, Amy Murphy Projects, for over a decade, from 1996 to 2008, completing numerous projects throughout the LA area, including the renovation of Rudolph Schindler's Yates Studio in Silver Lake. Additionally, she has acted as director of Film Forum, LA's oldest not-for-profit dedicated to experimental media. In 2015, Amy designed an exhibition, Haunted Screams, German Expressionist Cinema in the 1920s, in partnership with Michael Moulton's Architecture for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. At its broadest, Amy's written scholarship focuses on the relationship between media and urban experience. She's published several pieces examining our cinematic post-apocalyptic imagination, including The Future Nature of Tradition, New Orleans, Nature and Apocalyptic Trope, and Nothing Like New, our post-apocalyptic imagination as utopian desire. Amy is currently completing a new book examining the emergence of several new independent cinemas across the 20th century from the marginalized geographies of the American city between the 1920s and the 1980s. Our second panelist, John Mendrup, is going to follow through with thoughts on the role of architecture in experiencing film. With 23 years of retail and entertainment design experience, John brings a wealth of industry expertise to Beck's Work Play Group, which he oversees as its operations leader. With a specialty in design build delivery, John has led a number of large-scale projects, such as the Firewheel Town Center and the Domain in Austin, as well as niche boutique retail, such as the luxury building at Galleria Houston. John has also managed a variety of entertainment designs, such as the Royal Gorge Visitor Center, several new active prototype designs for Top Golf, projects for The Spot and Pinstack, and a portfolio of cutting-edge theater work for clients like Cinemark, EVO, Showbiz, Movie Tavern, Coyote Drive-In, and others. In addition, John manages the financial operations for Beck's architecture practice in Dallas and currently serves as the chair of the IAA Texo Steering Committee. Without further ado, please welcome Amy and John.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, John, and the Dallas Architecture Forum for including me in tonight's program. For my initial remarks, I've decided to focus on 2 points that have proven fundamental to my own teaching about film and architecture at USC, hoping they might provide a base for our later discussion. The first point is that most discussions about the relationship between architecture and film are really conversations about the city and the cinema. Truth of the matter is that more often than not, when people try to make a single piece of architecture about film or a single film about architecture, the results are more often about mimicry rather than synthesis. Not always, but often. Instead, I have found in teaching, if one telescopes out one notch from architecture and film to the broader categories of urbanism and the cinema, things get a lot more interesting. With this expansion allowing one to talk more easily about the broader trends in social norms, economics, and technology. It also allows one to more easily map the ever-changing relationship between time and space. And it's this relationship that for me forms the key connection between the cinema and the city, or film and architecture. The ever-changing relationship between time and space. And this brings me to my second point I wanted to mention. When I talk about the connection between film and architecture, I tend to stress that this relationship between time and space is not stable, and that it has continued to change for the near 200-year marriage between the cinema and the city, from the first mercury-produced photograph to today's digital features. While I'm being super reductive here tonight due to time, I would inevitably discuss in my seminar at least 3 core phases of this evolving relationship. The modern phase during industrialization, when our sense of time became more progressive or diachronic in nature, after the invention of thermodynamics, the steam engine, and faster forms of transportation. During this phase, not only the cinema, but modern architecture emerged. Time dominated space, or as Marx said, time annihilated space, reducing distances and putting the entire planet, both advanced and primitive societies, on the same timeline. To understand the domination of time over space in the cinema, we could really look at almost any example of pre-war film, but I tend to have this discussion around the city symphony movement in modernism and architecture, where the representation of time as movement is more important than any logic of geography. For design, we might look at the work of Le Corbusier, where space has become time and movement, rarely stopping, almost always becoming, or an example of the international style, which sought to put the entire world on the same historical timeline as the West. In the post-war period, matters of space and geography become more important, and the presumed dominance of diachronic time has become challenged, with the end of colonialization, US defeat in Vietnam, and the arrival of the environmental crisis. Not only do we start to question the cost of unfettered progress, but the consequences of uneven geography, where resources are not being evenly distributed, producing untenable levels of generational stagnation for those living in the margins of our cities. Because I teach in Los Angeles, I usually then have my student look at Charles Burnett's haunting work, Killer of Sheep, depicting the lives of the working poor living in the outcast ghetto of South Central LA during the 1970s. In such a film, the narrative drive is significantly weakened, and the role of spatial marginalization is significantly heightened. No neat narrative resolution is offered. The future is left uncertain for this community due to their multi-decade isolation from adequate resources in the area of housing, education, and employment, just miles from the booming central business district. In terms of design, I then might talk about the rise in preservation efforts during the 1970s onward in LA, highlighting what had been erased amongst us, such as in LA, where the creation of the Biddy Mason Park in the historic core, remembering and spatially reinscribing the once uncelebrated life of the freed slave Biddy Mason, who became a major property owner and entrepreneur in downtown LA during the 1880s. And lastly, at the end of my 15-week seminar, we might then try to grapple with what time and space might mean today in our split worlds between the digital and the real, and all the implication that has on our sense of self and the value of architecture. For that, I might ask my students to discuss the implication of Spike Jonze' movie Her, where the main character grapples with the paradox of living in a more connected but ultimately disconnected world. Or in terms of architecture, we might then look at Rem Koolhaas's Seattle Library project. Well, there's a lot to talk about when comparing these two works. What's most important to note is their mutual resistance to the erasure of the human body and of public space. Yes, they both embrace the idea of a more digitally oriented future, but they also demand the human body stay present and that urban spaces regain their sense of community. For me, both Her and the Seattle Public Library offer a way to talk about strategies of both and rather than either or in this digital age. As implied by this quote from an early MCI commercial back in 1997, we tend to be very utopian with the arrival of each new technology. I think my students can understand that now in 2021, as they are digital natives. And I'm interested to see how we might leverage the benefits of this historical hindsight to salvage the role of architecture and film in this new age, by continuing to understand the role of human experience in real space and our need to live collectively. So that's it for now. I hope these points contribute to a robust discussion later on whether or not we can still look towards architecture, or film for that matter, in providing meaningful collective experiences today. Thank you.
So regarding the topic of film in architecture, let's start by talking about the fact that there's some really exciting work being designed right now. There's a group called Oneplus Partnership out of Hong Kong, who's done a number of really exciting theaters, one of which is the Jinyi Cinema in China. The Jinyi Cinema utilizes warm stones and warm wood palettes to create a unique texture. It's almost an architectural pattern language that serves as the context for viewing films. What's unique about this is it gives the film watcher the experience of passing from the street, the day-to-day experience, through this created context to kind of cleanse the palate before sitting down and watching a film, both on the way in and the way out the door. And so it's really unique in that regard. They have a similar project called the Cine Sky Cinema, which achieves the exact same effect, but does it with a radically different palette and a different experience. So here it's cool blues and steel, projected image, stone tiles. And so what's great about it is they're, again, creating this separate textural context, but it's a unique experience. It's not something that is repeated throughout the theaters. Each one's a little different. So this approach is really, really cool, really exciting, but it's also pretty atypical because what we're seeing in these designs is a higher cost per square foot typically than we see in most theaters. Here in the United States in particular, but really worldwide, the revenue generated in movie theaters per square foot is pretty low compared to some other project types. And so we're challenged as architects to really make more design happen with less cost, and so we have to be more creative. One project that really does a great job with this is the Garage Screen Cinema in Moscow. This is by SNKH Studio. And so this takes a radically different approach to what a theater can be by stripping down the elements to just some of the basics. And so by reducing the theater itself to just a superstructure and a tensile fabric structure and relatively simple furniture and fixturing, they create a theater experience it's a little different approach because typically in the United States we would see a lot of separation between the theater from the outside world, but this is an approach that allows there to be some interactivity with the outside. And so you're going to hear sounds from the plaza outside. You're going to see changes in daylight or outside lighting, but it's okay because that is the experience. They're creating a unique place to watch a movie and you won't have that experience anywhere else. And so that's the focus. And so that really leads me into kind of where we work as a firm. Creating a unique experience is very much the hallmark of what we try to do with theater design. And so we try to differentiate the hi-fi experience from the lo-fi experience. The lo-fi experience I would define as one that's based on ease of acquisition or convenience. It's watching a movie on your big screen at home. The hi-fi experience is one that's based on the quality of the experience and the uniqueness of the experience. And so that's something we have to create. It's something that doesn't just happen by putting up a theater. We have to create uniqueness. We have to create that hi-fi experience to compete with a increasing ease of acquisition and comfort. And so some ways we try to achieve this in all of our entertainment-based projects. One of those is engagement with all five senses. It's not enough to just create a visual appeal that's surface level. There has to be texture. There has to be multiple readings, multiple levels of how we engage the architecture with the experience. We want connectivity, not just with the various functions of the building to one another, but also to the people, to social groups. We want to create and invite a social experience. And part of connectivity too is also creating something that's at the same time both complex, but also easy to read. You want to have texture, but you want people to understand where they go and what they're to do and not feel like an outsider. We want to create authenticity, what we call the vibe, something that's unique, the Instagram moment, something that's not seen commonly. And then also the biggest thing is we want to be deliberate in our design. We want the experience to be curated. We can't just throw a lot of cool elements together and expect it to come together. We have to create a concept and execute the concept and have it be discoverable by the end user. And so one project I'd like to share with you is a competition we did for Cinemark to create the theater of the future. We were invited along with a number of other architects to explore what would the theater of the future be. And so we approached it with the idea first of let's create drama in the experience. We want to build drama from the moment you walk up to the theater as you walk through the theater so that you've already started to have some level of excitement and engagement and fun before the movie even starts. And so that was goal number one. But we also wanted to deconstruct the movie-going experience into separate elements. And so you'll see some exterior elements that are different from the interior elements. And so you can watch a film maybe on the outside where it's less about hearing every bit of dialogue and more about the shared social experience and conversations about the movie. And this is also a space where you can mix in live performance with film performance, maybe even at the same time, to create a unique environment. And then finally, on the interior as well, we want to really pull apart the spaces. They're typically grouped together. Typically, the destination is the seat, and everything comes to the seat, the food, the beverage, everything. What we thought, let's pull these elements apart and create a series of separate interactive experiences where people can gather, talk, have a drink, watch a movie, but in any order and to whatever extent that person wants. And so we were fortunate enough to win this competition, but this did not turn into a theater, at least not in the typical way that we design theaters. But what it did do is it created a new prototype that we developed called the cut concept. And so here locally, you can visit a cut in Frisco. But the cut concept preserves a lot of the typical theater design elements, but it does so while still creating a little bit of the separation of spaces. So we do have a separate bar area. We do have a separate series of social spaces and unique architectural elements that call themselves out a little differently texturally, so that you can have a series of these shared events and shared experiences. And we also we're very successful in creating what we feel like is a hi-fi environment of materiality using very cost-effective materials. And so it's a little bit of what I would consider architectural sleight of hand, in the sense that we want to create the appearance of deep, rich texture without spending a lot of money unnecessarily. And so as I think forward about what's kind of next in architectural design for theaters, I think the challenges for all of us as architects is really pushing the envelope on design without spending a lot of money. And I think that's kind of an honest challenge for a designer, because it really relies on our own creativity more so than the elegance of the material itself. And the great thing about movie theaters as a typology is that it's one that naturally desires to be creative. It's one that naturally desires to be exciting. And so really the sky is the limit as a designer in terms of what you can achieve and what the expectations are, and your constraints are the budget. And so creativity reigns, and it should reign in terms of what we focus on as designers. And for that reason, I think it's a pretty exciting typology.
Amy and John, thank you so much for the presentations. They're really fun. I think we all have very memorable moments that we've all experienced in film. And a lot of them circle or focus on different architectural spaces, remarkable architectural moments. And so I think everybody would love to hear some of your thoughts on what were memorable moments for you. Amy, you want to start off with that?
Sure. You probably all get from my presentation, I think kind of categorically, rather than, I think it's just all those years in the classroom pulling things together. So I think there's, a kind of types that I really often enjoy. Sort of the modernism gone bad film, often I really am drawn to. So even like the latest film that got the Best Picture last year, Parasite, and sort of the idea of you have this utopian modernism, but then these class hierarchies that kind of undermine it in some way, or all the James Bond movies, and right up to the last one with Quantum Solace, this idea of somehow the layer of where the bad guy might be is somehow embedded in this kind of more utopian kind of space. And we love blowing up every lot in our house we can get, and they're just beautiful houses. So there's some pleasure there that's found in that violence, and I'm attracted to it too. The things that drove me to architecture gets blown up. There's just something very visceral about it. But other categories, most of us live our daily life in very banal spaces. So I love mall movies. I just love to see how they use those spaces, whether it's Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown or Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I mean, there's just something about the mall typology, and at least in the 80s and more at the booming times of what goes on there and what goes on. And the last one, I guess I'm drawn a lot to animation, especially Japanese anime, like the Ghost in the Shell movies, or even Wakanda with the Black Panther, or the Jetsons still holds up in terms of, they're very creative in the use of thinking about how we might live with technology and the dystopian side of it too. But so those kind of types are films that I tend to get drawn towards.
Yeah, the animes and animations are remarkable because they're one step kind of removed from reality, and yet they still embody that architectural essence very strongly.
Yeah, and it's same with the human characters, that idea that you can flex farther or go farther, but then there's consequences to that, and there's consequences to our built environment that we can kind of play out in that animated space. So I just find that all very interesting to watch. My family doesn't like watching movies with me because I'm always just kind of studying them instead of enjoying them. So it's the kind of drawback of doing what I do. But.
John, what are some that make a lot of remembrances in your own mind?
Well, I also love watching buildings getting blown up. I don't know what that reveals about us all, but that's kind of cool. But I like it when architecture is part of the storytelling of a film, and it's kind of neat when that happens. There's a movie that really stands out to me by Jim Jarmusch called Down by Law, and it tells the story of these three characters in a very small jail cell, and the jail cell becomes almost like one of the characters. This 15 by 15 room with bunk beds on either side, and they spend the bulk of the movie in this room, and then they finally escape. And they're running through the bayou in New Orleans, and they end up in a hunting lodge, and they walk into this lodge to take shelter, and it's a 15 by 15 room with 2 bunk beds. And they don't say a word about it, but it tells the story of the futility of their experience and the whimsy of it. And I love that direct tie-in. I love when architecture is used as a reflection of society, like in a dystopian movie like Gattaca, where it starts to kind of tell the story of cold and impersonal feelings. But then also, I think when architecture works on a less conscious level, it's pretty interesting. Darren Aronofsky's Pi is one of my favorites. And just really, as a movie about tension and stress and growing insanity is made even more present by these really tight spaces and tight camera shots. And similarly, The Shining, Stanley Kubrick, he painstakingly created a floor plan that couldn't exist in reality. And it's not something you perceive unless you're literally sketching while you watch the movie, but I think it registers on an unconscious level that there's something odd, there's something off. And so it helps to kind of build tension. Mm-hmm. But maybe my favorite example is just the fact that when buildings are upcast as ordinary buildings, it's kind of like, we've all had the experience of watching a movie or a TV show, and every actor is this dynamic, attractive, engaging person, even in a common role. And so movies do the same thing with buildings. And here locally in Dallas, we think about a movie like RoboCop. It's well known for being filmed in Dallas, even though it was set in Detroit. Ian Pai's City Hall is used as a very common building, a police station, because it's upcast. And one of my favorite films, Shane Carruth's Upstream Color, takes the Las Colinas Irving Convention Center, which is an interesting building, but it sits in a field by itself, and it recasts it as an office building in a much more dramatic way. And so I think anytime architecture is used to in that aspirational way, I think is really interesting.
One of the things while we were discussing it that you brought up was Reservoir Dogs, which is a Quentin Tarantino film where they used it is about a bank robbery, but the aftermath of that, and you never actually see the bank robbery. You never see the bank, and it's used as a shorthand. We all have an image of what a bank looks like, but it's never seen.
Yeah, the architecture fills the gap in your head. It's not actually ever present. It's really kind of a neat trick.
Yeah, very.
One of the things that you were going to say, Amy?
Oh, no, you keep going.
Okay. John, one of the things that we were also talking about is the ways in which filmmaking and architecture are similar as a discipline. You want to start off with that?
Yeah, well, so my thoughts on the similarities of the discipline, there are a lot. When I think of filmmaking, I think of it as this really deliberate, curated form of storytelling in which every little aspect is controlled and designed, and in some cases, in some directors and writers' cases, just very, very painstakingly created. And anyone that's worked in architecture understands that feeling in a building. And I think, architects go to a lot of lengths to do the same level of execution of a design concept into a painstaking level. And it's really interesting because I think on both levels, a lot of that level of detail may be missed on a majority of people that experience it, but that doesn't take away from the value of it. But one interesting differentiator to me is that I think films are a lot more controlling, or maybe just deliberate about how you experience it, which is not to say you don't take away a different experience. Two people take away a different experience from a film based on their own personal culture and context. But architecture, I think, is a lot more variable in how you experience it. And one of my favorite movie devices is the role of the unreliable narrator in a movie like, say, American Psycho, where you can't trust what you're being told. Well, I feel like when you experience architecture, you're kind of your own narrator, so you're kind of in control of your own reliability to some degree. I'm kind of a formalist myself. One of my favorite buildings is actually in Amy's backyard, Richard Meyer's Getty Museum. And the way you can move through that space in any order and experience it is pretty phenomenal. And there's an aspect of discovery that goes with that I think is unique to architecture. And, you know, one, you know, kind of more current and accessible version of that, if anyone's familiar with Meow Wolf, the entertainment venue, it's similar to that. It's an experience where you go and you can engage at whatever extent and degree you want, or maybe a lesser extent. But I think the painstaking level of detail is the same. The how you experience it is really where it starts to depart.
Mm-hmm.
Amy,
Yeah, I would agree with that in the sense that you know, having gone to film school and architecture school and made films and made architecture, I do feel like, and I did it not to become, I never did those things to become a set designer or an art director. I really love film and I love architecture. There's a lot about them, just as you would read a book rather than watch a movie, rather than go experience, you know, your own movie, your own night out on the town. You know, each one of those things are very, very different and should be like kind of appreciated for their own reality. On the other hand, I think everything that John was just talking about, especially the idea of the way architects can appreciate the way films get made. So the behind the scenes, there's a lot of similarities, not only with the director versus, you know, architect in black cape kind of fantasies that this is one being that does everything, when in reality, you know, films are so collaborative. You know, I've picked three very collaborative fields: education, filmmaking, and architecture. You know, you really have to like people and trust and really want to work with them. So I think as a field, in the way that they work and how collaborative and how the quote unquote specialties or consultants really is a kind of a ridiculous way of thinking about it, because each one is so essential to the whole. You really can't take away the editor from, nor could you the structural engineer. So, you know, they're really so unified in that way. I really discovered after film school, if I had to do it again, I probably would have focused on cinematography. I felt like that, being an architect day in and day out, worrying about, you know, where water is going, worrying about audio issues, worrying about light, kind of mastering technology, almost forcing it to not reveal itself, to allow life to happen in front of us, is so much what the cinematographer does, you know. And I really related to the cinematographers that I met and worked with. It is it's the last bastion of sort of the male film world. It's the only place women have made very little progress. So even though I discovered that, I was like, you know what, in my one little life, I just can't be, you know, there's so many other places for me to go, which is sort of unfortunate. I mean, there are some women making their place there, but it is truly the mindset of a cinematographer is very much like an architect. And, you know, Le Corbusier with his, you know, architecture is form and light. You know, there's this idea of the role of light. Really, films are about light and dark, and that is really essential to the way we think about space. So, and how they change from day to night. How, you know, Pierre Koning's case study house by day is an object, but by night it's a space. I mean, the form goes away. So, you know, cinematographers kind of understand what happens to form, you know, because of light. And it's a pretty exciting thing to just watch films without any sound on or anything, and just watch what's happening with the light, just like we would, you know, architecture is pretty exciting.
You know, one of the things when we were talking about, you brought up was some films are very much like architecture, just in the actual fabrication. I mean, you were talking about the Titanic set where they had to kind of make a ship that could be broken apart and come together again. Is really
Yes.
an act of love and passion to make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, the first person I worked for in LA when I arrived here, he's a USC grad, his name's Charles Lee, and he worked for Foster. He worked on the Hong Kong Bank and really loves technology. And he was hired, you know, every recession, we lose a lot of architects to the film world out here. And this was the recession back in the 90s. And I went off to film school and he went off to build the set for the Titanic. And, you know, that's so complicated. The set had to, like, get filled up with water, break apart, and then in 10 minutes after the coffee break, all come back together again and be ready for the second shot. So it was an incredible, incredible, production that really couldn't have happened without architects being the best sort of architects that they can be. So that is a very exciting side of it. And it's just really tough out here. Some of my best students, get swallowed up by the jobs that they can get on set in some ways. So
it's interesting too, because it really makes me think that process is so similar. There was an author named Douglas Cooper that wrote a novel called Amnesia a number of years back, and it wasn't about architecture in the slightest, but he referred to it as an architectural novel because he structured the way he wrote the book like he would an architectural design. He was an architect by training. And I see that a lot in films, and really good films, this idea that there's a permeating concept or a permeating idea, kind of like you described, that just it's very cyclical. And so I see a lot of tie-in in terms of the way filmmakers think about that and the way architects think about design.
Yeah, I found that when I went to film school, I went to film school after architecture school, and I was surrounded at USC with, they could get the brightest kids from Harvard and Princeton and Yale, but some of them studied literature and other things. Maybe music helped out in terms of process. But honestly, the athletes and the architects and those people could understand process more than, most your average kid, just for how much goes in the reiteration and the rethinking and the reapproach to everything, and to unknit the sweater and then reknit it again. It's just something that most people don't get, they're much more linear in their thinking. So we do train architects to be able to say, what, we better go backwards to go forwards, or try to figure it out in a different way, and not be overwhelmed when all of a sudden, it's raining and you didn't plan it to rain, or, whatever. I don't know, you're a bit more agile, I think, once you're trained as an architect.
Very interesting. Yeah. During your presentation, Amy, we were talking a lot about how space and movement, how it's so profound in the creation of filmic moments. How do you think that's changed over time, and what are your current thoughts on how space, movement, and time all combine to make memorable films?
Well, it's interesting because in some ways, as a narrative form, it's not changing all that much, although I do think it's going to be drastically. It's only 100 years old, really, from the 1880s to the 1980s is really truly when film, as we call it, film, existed. And since, after the 1980s, it turned digital, and before that it was photography. And so it will radically change. We're only about 30 years into that next transformation with the changing technology. So, but the narrative form itself, I think, is going to be with us. It's been here since Aristotle. It will be manipulated in some way, and something like Citizen Kane being a high point of a piece of cinema, which creates this hero effect through the narration like you would Ulysses, but then undermine it by Rosebud, the small element from his childhood, and how film was the perfect medium to kind of show that 20th century great man who couldn't get beyond himself in his own childhood. That story was very particular to that medium. So I think we'll have new stories as things change, new alliances that will happen between wherever we're heading in the medium. And there'll be just these magical moments in the future. But and in some ways, when we were talking, the films that just prepping for this presentation, the films that really focus on space. I think of the films coming out of Japan and Ozu, and out of China. There's In the Mood for Love. This is all like it's just about space. They hardly speak at all in terms of the film, and it's just this relationship played across space. Usually those have no real technology in them. There's no phones. There's maybe some cars, but not a whole lot. And so the technology, as I don't know, I think most people experience rewatching an old film from like the late, mid 90s, and someone's using a flip phone. It just takes you out of the situation because the technology actually tells kind of how old the film is. The story can be timeless, but the technology kind of belies, it ages it. So I think, I don't know, I think directors are always trying to figure that out, that balance between being of the here and now and relatable, But if they want their work, it's sort of like architecture too. If you really want your work to last, architecture is the art form that needs to last, but that also can get undermined by too much reliance on technology as well. So I think those things are things I look at, what works, what doesn't work in that way. So yeah.
When we were talking, the opposite to technology, when we were talking about Blade Runner and how Blade Runner has captured everybody's imagination, and then people forgot it, and then now you can reuse it as a tool in your classroom.
Yeah.
But we also found that some of the sets in there were symbolic of life in the future, even though they were up to 100 years old.
Exactly. And that's what's so interesting to see, like something like the Bradbury Building, which was built in the 1880s or so, 1890s in Los Angeles, when film was exactly being invented, and yet it represents the future in some way. So, architecture will continue to have that role, or the Ennis Brown house in that film as well, this Mayan modernist house that also represents the future in some way. So I think architecture and the marriage between the two will remain constant, because they do have that desire for timelessness, even though they're so tied to current day technologies.
The other thing that we were talking about some too was how the technology of film has changed a lot, and it's requiring it to be less concise, and how that impacts the storytelling that we're all witnessing now, where films are tending to get longer just because it's affordable for them to do that.
Yeah, I think that's John's world in terms of getting people in the seats and enjoying it in a public way, because they're so long you can't even fit in a dinner at night. So anyways, maybe John.
Yeah, well, it's funny, Amy, you made that observation when we were prepping about movies getting longer, and it's funny because it seems like it would be happening the opposite way. It seems like in our short attention span culture, movies would be getting shorter, and they would just end up being music videos at some point, and they don't last very long. But it's weird. You're right. It's happened the other way, and I think it's interesting because I think when I watched your presentation the first time and you talked about the changing concept of time and space, that sounded incredibly unsettling to me, but because they seem like things that would be very constant. But as I started thinking about that and thinking about them in relation to film, it's certainly true. And our perception of those things changes. And so, if you kind of reflect on how that's affecting film today, I certainly see that film is more ambitious in a lot of ways. Budgets go up, a lot of things that are attempted are just so much more ambitious. But at the same time, there's such a reliance on formula and on plot devices and on the same stories. And so you really start to see the emergence of these specialty or these unusual films that separate themselves from what's commonly consumed. And so I think that really is fascinating to me. And that's kind of something we also see in architecture, the idea of cult status of movies and cult followings of buildings. And so I do enjoy that comparison. And then thinking about, cinema today, what's going on in movie theaters and keeping people in the seats. I think the biggest challenge for movie theater goers today, or movie theater operators really today, is the loss of the social. Because movies have always had a very big social impact in society. And what we've seen over time is that the theaters themselves have become a lot less social. And what I'm saying, I guess, is really that architecture is a portion of the reason why. Because people take their cues from architecture. If you place chairs in a room, people will sit. If you don't, they will stand. They learn how to interact with the building from the cues you give them. And what we see in theaters a lot is very large spaces designed not to have you gather and talk and spend time together. Most times if I see a movie late, I feel like I'm being ushered out largely by people holding brooms and waiting for me to go. And so I do think that if the social is taken out of movies altogether, they will struggle, because it's such an important part of society of going to the movies, is having the ability to have a conversation. It's one of the strangest social experiences we have, going and sitting in a dark room quietly with someone for an hour and a half, 2 hours. But it's because of the other element, the discussion that follows, the time spent together. And so I think maybe that biggest challenge moving forward will be that maintaining and recreating the social aspect.
Yeah, and that's what I loved about your presentation. I didn't really know your work, but I just really enjoyed how you weren't trying to make the movie theater part of being in the movie. You're actually making everything except for watching the movie more exciting and contributing to the memory of that evening in some way, the before and after. And I think that's a commitment to collective life that I think only could help the movie itself as a form, as a, endure. And I really think the examples that you showed in your own work, I think that is the ticket. And so if they could make the movie shorter and give you their budget to make the that space work, I actually think that would be a better turnaround.
It's funny. There's a restaurant in Austin, Texas. It's since gone out of business. It's a casualty of COVID, but it was called Shady Grove, and it used to show film projector movies on a screen, slightly out of focus, black and white with no sound in the background. And it was never about watching the movie, but it was about creating an ambience. It was almost like a higher end version of having the TV on while you have dinner. It was just another textural aspect of eating outside in this restaurant. And it was kind of cool. And I do think, there is more of a desire to make the movie the most important thing rather than the person that's watching the movie the most important thing. And I think that's maybe a shift that still needs to progress a little bit.
Yeah.
We were having, John, you and I were talking with Amy about that moment when you've gone through a long film together and it's been a provocative film in some way, and you come out and you're all of a sudden having a candid, interesting conversation with a complete stranger. Now, you may have been just sitting with them, but you didn't know they were right there, and how that's just a kind of a really interesting communal moment that we kind of underappreciate.
Absolutely. I'll never forget watching Pulp Fiction on opening night in a crowded theater, and nobody knew what was happening in that movie because it was so unlike anything we had seen. And just the visual recoil from all these shocking scenes, it was almost like, we were all experiencing this really strange experience together, and people talking about it afterwards. It was fascinating. And I shared a story about how I saw a David Lynch film at a late night showing at a really strange film in Austin, and exited out to the outside, and it was foggy outside. I felt like I was still in the movie for, at least, another 20 minutes walking back to my apartment. But those experiences, I think they go to speak about how much we get invested into movies, how much we kind of live in that moment. Amy talked a lot about feeling cinematic, and I think we get a little moment of feeling cinematic when we're part of that. And I think that discussion and that interaction is key.
Yeah.
I was on vacation and saw Nate, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Go ahead. Talk about vacation. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was in New Orleans, and we were on vacation, and we went into a theater and saw Silence of the Lambs, but it was a matinee, and we went in, and it was broad daylight, and spent a couple hours inside the theater, and came out to a pitch black kind of environment in New Orleans, and we had the memory of Silence of the Lamb and how that really stayed with us. So the whole kind of experience of when you saw it, how you moved through, and how you came out of the thing was profound and increasing the creepiness of the movie.
Absolutely.
We want to give the audience opportunity to give questions. I mean, amazing discussion. So if you have questions, there's a Zoom Q&A button there. You can just type it in, and we will cover some of those. So we have one already. So the question is, this is for all of you, all the panelists, and John. Can you speak to the evolution 100 years ago of the creation of the Nickelodeon to the building of great movie palaces, and now the more modern movieplex that houses multiple screens? Many of the movie palaces are being restored, while streaming platforms are also changing the dynamic of film presentation. So what's coming next? Maybe start with John Mendrick. That's been one of your areas of expertise.
Well, yeah, so I can't really speak a lot to the development from the Nickelodeon area to the movie palaces, but kind of moving from that, I will say that, so really we have to look at two different groups. We have to look at the boutique theaters and the more commercial theaters. And so for the boutique theaters, I agree, some of the best work happening, especially in the United States, are the renovation of historic buildings. And there's something really, I think, exciting about repurposing a classic piece of architecture for the purpose of showing films, even if temporary. And some of the more exciting examples of that are the ones where a building is temporarily created into a theater and then turned back to something else. Now, the kind of the big screen multiplex, I think there's a phase that we're kind of coming out of in our industry where it was about quantity more so than quality, about getting a lot of people access to theaters. And I think that's certainly a noble idea, but I think what we're starting to see, at least from our clients, is more of a focus on the authentic experience, because as we talked about, big screens are getting nicer, the home experience is getting higher quality. And so I think movie theaters realize they need to offer something more. They need to offer something beyond that. And so I think what we will see moving forward is maybe a return more to the higher end theater experience.
Yeah. And I think that one thing to watch on that, just for the is what neighborhoods where these complexes get built, and that really is the history of the Nickelodeon, which was a placed in working class neighborhoods traditionally, cheap, fast movies, very loud, actually, quite raucous, what would go on, because they were these shorter films, and people coming in and out and talking. And we were talking when we were talking about this, getting to this evening together, there's some famous short films by D.W. Griffith and other people about trying to almost train the audience to behave and become these silent spectators. As the films got longer, and sound came on, you needed to start being trained how to sit in your seat and behave in a certain way. And that when the films got longer, because it all started in vaudeville through to the Nickelodeon and then into the feature-length films, the complexes started getting bigger, and the movie stars and all of that. And so you've got these big theaters. And it is quite interesting that the really big and the really small is probably going to do okay. And it's that mid-level. I think the suburbs are going to suffer. I think maybe, this is all speculative. I really don't know. But although we're all waxing, sadness and upset that, like, the Cinerama Dome here in LA, which is big screen, it's where you want to see Lawrence of Arabia, or if there was a good Star Wars to be seen or something, you'd want to go there, because it's that big widescreen experience, and they just shut in the pandemic. I'm not as worried with that. Not only is it protected through heritage conservation as a space, but I think that experience is still viable. Someone's going to take that over and do something with it. But I don't know what's going to happen to the suburban fiveplex. But at some level, my experience at those, I don't know. I'd actually rather probably be at home or in the big screen. So I don't think I'm alone there. As well. So who knows?
Another question. Go ahead, John Orfield.
Well, I was just going to say that I have a spectacular home television setup, but there is something really spectacular about going to a large theater and being enveloped, and also having shared crowd audience reactions.
Yeah. Yes. So the next question is, talk about the tradition. You've talked about the traditional movie theater setting, but how do drive-in theaters fit into the experience of film?
Well, I'm happy to start. We've done a couple of drive-in theaters, more modern drive-in theaters. It's a different approach, certainly. One thing we've seen that's really interesting in drive-in theaters, when I was younger, when I was a kid, my parents took me to drive-in theaters. There really wasn't much to it. You paid your ticket, you drove to your spot, you put your speaker on your window, and you watched the screen. And now I think kind of the modern take on the drive-in theater experience is that you get out of your car and you do something else. And it's interesting to me, the few times I've gone, I've noticed a lot of people not sitting in their cars and watching the movies. It's almost, again, this idea of ambiance more than film. And I think if someone really wanted to really engage deeply and focus on a movie, they probably wouldn't go to the drive-in. They're going for that social, for that different experience. And so when we design those, we do a lot of outdoor seating areas. There's a big food and beverage component. And again, it's trying to drive this idea of, hey, let's create a social environment should people use it. And what we've seen by and large is that's exactly why people go. They go for the social.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's how, as teenagers, we used it. So,
it's an interesting thing. At first, we thought that the drive-in theater was going away, but actually, what's happened is that the car has gone away, and we still enjoy sitting outside in the dark watching a film. And we used to do that in our neighborhood. We would erect a large sheet and project when digital projectors first came out. It's an interesting, within the history of film too, the initial early drive-ins had trouble getting films at their theaters, and it generated a whole series of B-class films that were made. And that was in many ways, the start of the horror genre that then became a staple of inside theaters.
Great. Next question, Audrey. This one, I guess, to Amy. Says, can you expand on the cinematic nature of the work of Le Corbusier?
Sure. I think that just there's so much about the convergence of modernity in that even the first films were these trains coming into the station, this idea of this kinetic movement that's possible in modern life, and that fluidity, I think is something, even if you just look at the philosophy about, the movement from the car into the space, up the curvilinear stair, through space. Space is never containing you. You're always kind of moving. Even if you're sitting, your eyes are moving, the light's moving, everything's moving in a sense. It's much more cubistic in that way. Sort of Duchamp's new coming down the stairs, descending the stairs, this idea that really everything's always in motion. And then even Villa-Savoye, even ending the journey with framing it, looking out at nature. I can't, whether it's 500 Blows by Truffaut, or there's so many films end with someone arriving at the beach, or this idea of this, you put man sort of back in nature again after whatever journey they've gone through, is something that's very cinematic about that building and just Corbe's work in general. That everyone's being seen. It's kind of comes out of the Paris Opera. Even from the 18th century, this idea that we do go to these urban experiences, whether it's going to the opera or the movie theater or whatever, to be watched as much as to be to watch. And Richard Sennett, who's a theorist, talked about how by late modernism, something like the Lever House in New York, that turned into alienation, that we actually felt very, in a sense, uncomfortable in that modernity of always being watched. He claims at that point that because we've sort of lost our sense of privacy, our private self, people only feel comfortable in a public sphere if their private sphere is secure. And so this idea that this, late Corbe and late modernity, corporate modernity, kind of lost that, about that. But early Corbe is really about that mobility and that beginning, middle, end, and moving through it and returning to nature and all those sort of things that a lot of the cinema also mimicked in some way.
Yeah, we've got two last questions we'll cover. So the first one I'll direct to John Linder. So the question is, as the entertainment film industry starts catering more to direct-to-consumer business approach, how's the job of the architect with the Entertainment Architect Challenge, and what tools can be used to combat that kind of getting around the theater experience?
That's a great question. That's really the kind of the big question mark I have too. So I can speculate a little bit, but I don't know the answer. I think a lot of people are wondering, well, how will theaters rebound after COVID? And I think in reality, theaters are doing really well in terms of managing sanitation, a healthy environment. Most people don't know this, but actually theaters generally are pretty sustainable. They have pretty good air quality design in terms of how they're originally designed. And so I think the actual nature of the theaters is it's very, I guess, scalable in terms of response to the pandemic. However, the big question is the one you brought up. How will this direct to consumer film distribution affect theaters? And I think it's a big concern. And so we're waiting to see if that's something that's going to return back to a more distribution-based production, or if it's going to stick around. If it sticks around, I think it really puts a lot of pressure on the theaters to offer even more, to do something that really makes it about a special engagement. And, the challenge to architects, therefore, becomes, really creating a unique experience that is not like everything else. And I think if that were to stick around, it would drive the challenge of design even higher. That may not be a bad thing for us as moviegoers and architects. It would put some pressure on the industry, but I like the idea of even better spaces and really special theaters that really draw you out to see them, because it is so much better experience than watching at home. But again, I think that would be a difficult financial situation for the operator.
Yeah. So last question for all three of you. The question is, do you have any movies you would recommend that you think provide a unique insight into how people move through or interact with architecture in the course of the movie?
I remember after I was in Rome seeing this film called The Great Beauty, and it was probably from maybe 10 years ago or so. And it just really, I think one of the guides I had or something, who had recommended it. And it really does capture kind of moving through Rome and all those great buildings, and just almost like it's a modern city, but yet in this historical context. So I think of that one in terms of really really needing that city and all the monuments within it. So the great beauty.
John Mender.
Well, I'm going to cheat and just name a director rather than a specific movie. I mentioned Jim Jarmusch earlier, but I really think particularly all of his early films have an aspect of that. He really combines movement through space and cultural interaction between people of different cultures in just about every movie he makes. And I think each one of them is fantastic. Night on Earth, Down by Law, Mystery Train, all those are fantastic films. And I think they do a good job of that.
And John Orfield.
My current favorite film that haunts me and I love is Arrival. It's Amy Adams. And one of the things that's so wonderful about that is the discussions about time and how you move through time. But I also really love the spacecraft that was created for the aliens in that case, in the changing of gravity and how it works within that space, and that you move through the spacecraft vertically, and then when you arrive, there's another whole spatial organization. The whole thing keeps flipping and rotating, and it's an analogous to the whole theme of that time keeps flipping and moving and changing, and it can move forwards and backwards. And so it's just something that I just love the feeling of and have looked at multiple times.
Let's see. Thank you. Amy, someone said, what was the name of the movie about Rome you just mentioned?
The Great Beauty.
The Great Beauty. Okay, thank you. So speaking of thank you, thanks to all three of you for a amazing, intriguing, thought-provoking program. I mean, your knowledge base for each one of you is amazing, and how you shared, I think, makes us all want to go out and experience the cinema and architecture. So Amy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And John Orfield, thank you for organizing, moderating, and putting all this together. And to our viewers, thanks for joining us. Hope that everyone has a great evening. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Really
Bye-bye.
enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.